without further ado, let me reintroduce to all of you Professor Keith Murnion from Kellogg.
So I can't think of a better group to see and talk to and, get me that much more excited about the book. So thank you all for coming. I'm going to try and just give you a taste of the book. I have up here on page 1 that my publishers have told me, get everyone you can to pre-order. and the reason for that is the book comes out at June 14th, and pre-orders all count for that first week of sales. And if the first week of sales are enough to get it to a bestseller list, then life is easy. So, pre-order, and if you're interested in bulk orders, let me know. I can get you a discount. So, as Andre pointed out, CNBC.com picked it as one of the 12 business books to look for in 2012. What a treat this is. I had no idea that was coming through, but it did, and that's gotten people excited. So Kellogg has a Twitter feed, and I started hearing from all sorts of alumni because they sent out Twitter message about it. Let me tell you a little bit about the structure of the book and how it came about. Every 10 years, I do an information dump. What have I been teaching for a while? Can I put it into a book? And things evolve over a 10-year time, so usually I have enough material for half of a book. So I do the information dump, and then I have to fill in the rest. But it was pretty clear what the structure of this book was going to be. When you put together a book proposal, you do an outline, you do 2 chapters, you do a marketing plan, other things like that, and you try and get an agent. Now, it's ironic that people who know how to negotiate have to have an agent to negotiate their contracts. Very sad, but publishers won't look at a proposal unless it comes from an agent. So I had a colleague who had signed a really nice contract with an agent, first time book. So I contacted this agent. His name is Jim Levine in New York. We had a great time talking. I sent him my proposal. He gave me feedback. We had actually a series of 6 or 7 conversations molding the proposal, getting it ready for publishers. And I think it was the 6th conversation with him. I said, Jim, don't you think we ought to sign a contract about this sometime soon? And he said, Keith, I thought we already did that. I knew he was the right agent because he was into it without even having a contract. But the reason I tell you about Jim is he said, Do Nothing was not initially the first chapter. It was going to be the title. It was always going to be the title. This particular title is, I think, what sold the book and might actually get people to take it off a bookstore shelf because it's a little different, to say the least. But he looked at my other chapters and he said, you need each chapter title to be contrarian. Things like ignore performance goals, de-emphasize profits. I'm not a contrarian kind of guy, but I thought about it a lot, and he was exactly right, because what I wanted to do was challenge what people think about leadership normally. And so a little bit of a shot, a little bit of a contrarian approach, I hope is going to do the trick. Each chapter has a bunch of material, research ideas, but usually a story as well. And we reorganized the book, again, Jim's idea, to put Do Nothing in the first chapter. Some of you have heard this in my leadership lectures. Some of the older KS students, this is kind of news, right? And it's the way things develop over a 10-year period. I mean, my KSO 1s and 2s were around when I was doing that decision-making book that the rest of you have had to read. So anyway, in the meantime, what I thought I'd do is tell you a quick story from each of the chapters. Dave being promoted to an IT manager is my Do Nothing story. And one of several stories about Do Nothing. Dave was in an EMP class at Kellogg, and while he was in the course, he got promoted to be the IT manager of his company. And he called me about it because we'd been talking about it. He said, Keith, I just got this big promotion. I said, congratulations, Dave. Awesome for you. I bet you're really excited. He said, I'm excited about everything except The fact that I'm not sure I can do IT anymore. I love to do IT, and now that I'm the manager, I don't think I can do it. And I said, Dave, you're right, you can't. And he said, but I really love doing IT. I said, tough, too bad. We had a 35-minute conversation where all we talked about was he can't do IT anymore. And, I was hammering him over the head with, now that you're the manager, you got to let the other guys do it. You have to start doing nothing. He couldn't. It was just beyond him. He told me later, he tried to restrain himself, but when he talked to some of his IT people and they were working on a problem, he'd just say, well, let me just show you this. And he'd jump on their keyboard and hammer away a little bit. And some of you are nodding your heads because you know exactly how this happens. He lost his best IT person because of it, because he was micromanaging, right? Finally, he realized he had to go cold turkey, stop doing IT. He's been much more successful since, and he overcame the loss of that one particular IT person. Focus on them. Most of us have a approach to life that can't help but focus on ourselves. One of the stories I wanted to tell in this chapter that got edited out was there's a professor I know who rides his bike to work as often as he can. And this particular professor, in riding to work, every time in the morning he'd get to the office, he'd think, thank goodness the wind will be with me when I ride home, because it seems to be in my face this morning. But then he'd get on the bike in the afternoon and it seemed like the wind was in his face again. And it's like, why is it day after day? There's a seat up here, or the one back there. Why day after day is the wind into me in the morning and into me in the afternoon? Something is wrong here. Do you know how long it took me to figure out? This professor to figure out? You create wind resistance yourself, but you're so focused on yourself that you don't realize that you're the one causing it. And you got to get your focus away from yourself to be a great leader. In the great country of the United States, there's a debate about whether waterboarding is torture or if it's an acceptable interrogation technique. Have any of you experienced waterboarding? I hope not. But I have a colleague who has done extensive experience on what he calls the empathy gap. When you are engaged in an emotional activity, you understand it, you feel it. When you're not engaged in it and you're just watching it, you just don't have the same kind of understanding. And it's amazing to me that there's a debate about whether waterboarding is torture. Absolutely amazing. What's interesting is how some people have actually resolved it. They've volunteered to be waterboarded. And a particular journalist who writes for Vanity Fair, I think his name is Christopher Hitchens. He volunteered to be waterboarded. He was able to withstand it for about 12 seconds before he called it off. And he thought he was a wimp. He was really disappointed with himself for only withstanding it for 12 seconds. So what did he do? He said, let's try it again. I think I can do better next time. No dice. It's an absolutely horrific experience. So what does this have to do with leadership? You've got to focus not on yourself, but on other people. Sometimes, are all of you engaging in waterboarding at work? Maybe not, but some of the things that we expect of the people who work for us, we really don't understand as well. When I was teaching at the University of Illinois, one of our graduate students was my age, wasn't one of my students, worked with one of my colleagues. And he and his wife were just wonderful people. So we would see them occasionally, have dinner. And finally, his advisor had a baby. And his wife told me that was the best thing that ever happened to her husband, having his advisor have a baby. Realized, the constraints that happen to people, and he was a whole lot less demanding after that. I've created what I call the leadership law. For those of you who remember Isaac Newton And the fact that I sometimes talk about his third law of nuclear dynamics, I think that's it. His third law, I always used to call it just Newton's law, but my editor said it's his third law. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. With leadership, we don't pay enough attention. If you focus on them, it also means focusing on the reactions you want, not the actions that you're going to take. And if you can do this and think first of reactions, and only then think of what you're going to do, you have a much better chance of succeeding. And as I like to say, and I present a couple stories from history, leaders who don't think enough about other people's reactions are the ones who, with great intentions, make horrendous mistakes that put them in the history books for a long time. Start at the end. I had to talk a little bit about basketball. You guys know I had to talk about basketball. And I love talking about Phil Jackson. You'll see I mention him again later in the book. Horace Grant was the guy who did dirty work for his first 3 championship teams in Chicago. And what I love about this is that what Phil Jackson did was he was always focused on, let's win a championship. I don't care how many games we win this year, as long as we win the last game of the season. And Horace Grant was his guy for doing dirty work. So Horace was 6'10", robust, fantastic athlete. But he was the guy who never had a play called for him, but he was remarkable at rebounding, defense, doing the dirty work. Phil was really successful in influencing Horace, but Horace was great in his ability to be influenced and the fact he was influenced. The beauty of the Horace Grant story is we almost have a perfect experiment in basketball with him because he had an identical twin who also played pro basketball, but for different coaches. And his twin had an 11-year career, earned a total of $23 million playing basketball. Pretty good. Anybody want to trade careers? Not a bad thing, right? Horace had a 15-year career and $63 million. He did the dirty work more than his brother. Otherwise, they were incredibly comparable. But Phil Jackson, just amazingly superb to focus at the end and win championship after championship. Well, there's a lot we can learn from that. Trust more is a chapter that was part of the proposal. I have 2 quick stories for you here. Alice was a manager in a company. I may have mentioned her in one of our classes. I never remember which stories I mentioned in which classes, but she worked in a small company that had 3 different divisions, each of which was about 100 miles apart. She was in Division A, and a big mistake was made in Division B, 100 miles away. The minute she heard about it, she raised her hand and she said, "It was my mistake. I'll take responsibility. I apologize." And everybody looked at her like she was crazy. How could you have made the mistake? You're not even in the same location. She said the next time somebody in any of the different divisions made a big mistake, she raised her hand and said, "I apologize." And this was a woman in one of my classes, and everybody in the class was looking at her like she was crazy. She became the company apologizer. Every time a big mistake was made, she raised her hand and apologized. She said, as she explained this, "We got beyond the problem. We did try to figure out why it happened, but blame wasn't part of it because I was the one who apologized." She said, "By the way, it hasn't hurt my career at all. I've been promoted faster than I even anticipated." She'd apologize, people would smile, and they would know to move forward. She knew she could trust the people she worked with to not give her grief, even though she was doing something strange. Second example, I was in Shanghai a couple years ago. I did a negotiation workshop for a friend of mine's company. The workshop was Friday and Saturday. My flight was Sunday evening. So how many have been to Shanghai? It's a great city, all sorts of things going on. And I think it's the old city. I can't remember the name of the neighborhood, but I wanted to go shopping, bring some funky stuff home for my family. So my host pointed me to this area, and it was thriving with all sorts of people Sunday morning, shopping, eating in restaurants, you name it. I looked a little different from most of the people there. Somehow or another, they knew I was a tourist. And all these young guys would come up to me and say, would you like to buy a watch? Would you like to buy this? I got really tired of it. So I kind of reacted in a way that I wasn't raised. I didn't even answer them. I acted like I didn't know what they were saying. Finally, they'd stop asking. It was great. So I could wander around and be less bothered. But I started to get hungry, and I went into a couple restaurants, and I speak no Chinese, and man, was this confusing. People going to different locations, getting food in various places, paying in other places, and some of you know what I'm talking about, and it's like, how can a white guy figure this out, So I went into 3 restaurants, couldn't figure out how it was gonna work, and I'm wandering around getting hungrier and hungrier. And all of a sudden I hear a voice behind me, are you looking for something? And again, I think it's some young guy. Turns out, I look around, and then he said, so you're not gonna talk to me? I turned around, and here's a short Chinese man about 60 years old wearing a New York Yankees baseball cap. And I said, I'm sorry, I apologize. I've just been battered with people trying to sell me stuff all day, and so I stopped talking to people. And he said, oh, so what are you looking for? And I said, I'm getting hungry. I'd love to have a nice light lunch. He said, do you like tea? I don't know where he came up with that question, but I drink over a gallon of tea a day. I said, yes, very much. He said, well, there's 2 tea tasting cafes nearby. One of them, though, some movie stars visited recently, so the prices are way high, but the other one, you can taste as many teas as you want. It's also a tea school. So I thought, well, let's take a risk. Let's trust this guy. Why don't you have lunch with me? So I figured the downsides couldn't have been too bad. So we go to lunch. It's really funny. He ordered snacks with a really big N. Snacks. I don't know, just the way he pronounced it. And I tried 10 different teas. I spent way too much on tea there, but what a great lunch. And just for the lunch and the tasting, for the 2 of us, was $15. Here you got a city of 10 million people, a complete stranger, could have led me who knows where. What a deal. Sometimes it pays to trust people. And by the way, I'm from Chicago. This Yankees hat didn't buy him any points. Didn't buy him any points at all. Release control, deviously. So we talk about structural control in my classes, as you all know, and many of you have been told, don't read chapter 5. And what do we do with chapter 5 of the decision-making book but staple it shut? How many have ripped open the staples and read chapter 5 when they weren't supposed to? See, nobody does. Oh, Andre raised his hand. He's the only one who, I know some of you probably did, but it kind of works. It's structural control. John was a CEO, and he took his top management team on an orienteering course. Everybody know what orienteering is? And who doesn't know? Okay, so orienteering is out in wonderful kinds of environments where you get a map, checkpoints, you have a compass, and you're supposed to make your way from one checkpoint to the next as quickly as possible and return. Usually it's an individual task and you run over the woods and through the trees and all of that, but you can do it as a group. John with his top management team, they're all decked out. This is northern Wisconsin, beautiful landscape, kind of like outside of Toronto. They get their map. He says, I know where we're going, follow me. Well, he takes a beeline from point A to point B, and on their map it shows a bit of a swamp between point A and point B, but they're all outfitted with boots, so he thinks it's not going to be a problem. So he starts taking off, and the water's shallow and they're doing fine, but then the water's getting deeper, and he's getting farther and farther in front of them, and farther and farther in front of them, and finally somebody shouts out, John, I think this is the wrong way. This is a guy who didn't release control. didn't ask a question of any of his team members. He was up to here in water. His boots were only knee-highs. They were completely useless by that point, but he still wanted to go straight ahead. This is a good exercise for him and exactly why we should release control. Bear Down Wormley's chapter 6, and we start out by asking the question, do nice guys finish last? The answer is yes and no. You know, sometimes you have to be nice, sometimes you have to be tough, sometimes you have to release control, sometimes you have to take control. This is one of the dilemmas of leadership. But all of you remember cut your time in half? Anybody not remember cut your time in half? Oh, come on, you gotta, I'm one of our EMP students in Evanston. I had them do the tennis ball exercise at the beginning of the program, and then I had them for a course at the end, and I said, so did anybody apply anything you learned with my first course? And they were all scratching their heads, and the one guy raised his hand. He said, I used to have team meetings. We'd meet for an hour every week, reports, updates, etc. I cut it in half. It's now cut it to 30 minutes. Everything got done just as well in 30 minutes. So I cut it in half again. 15 minutes for his team meetings. He said we get just as much accomplished. There's one downside. People who have to drive in from off-site wonder why they're having to drive in for a 15-minute meeting. But they're still accomplishing it in 15 minutes. So you do have to push sometimes, but with a little warmth. Ignore performance goals. Pay more attention to learning. Okay, and I usually focus on learning a lot on my slide, and some of you might remember that. But here's a corollary and something that I talk about a bit in the chapter. And it applies to leading people, leading adults, as well as to our own children. All of you have smart children. You wouldn't be here in this program if you weren't smart, and intelligence has a genetic component to it. So your kids are smart. Many of them are going to do really well in school. When they come back with good grades, there's two typical responses people have. One response is, oh, you did really well, you must be really smart. Or, you did really well, you must have worked really hard. The really smart message is absolutely terrible. And research with kids shows that this is awful. You really worked hard and emphasized the hard work, so much more effective. What a psychologist at Stanford has done is identified two kinds of mindsets about our basic abilities. One, a fixed mindset, and we were born with our talents and born with intelligence, and we can't do much better than what we've got, versus a growth mindset. And remarkably different performance in all sorts of situations. If you have a team, or if you take the idea that people have skills, people have a level of intelligence and potential that's fixed and can't be changed, performance on all sorts of different criteria is not going to improve anywhere near as much as a growth mindset. And the beautiful part about a growth mindset is you can encourage people to adopt it. You can show them how there is growth, even for people who are as old as me and a couple select other people in this room. Okay? So you don't have to get dumber as you get older. It's no longer true. The data doesn't support it, and a growth mindset also helps that. Another way to think about it is some of these old quotes that the internet is pretty nice to fill in the gaps in your books sometimes. And these were some that I just couldn't resist. You can't control the wind, but you can adjust your sails. Pray to God, but row for shore. There is no bad weather, only bad judgment. It is better to light a candle than to curse the darkness. Trust in Allah, but tie your camel. De-emphasize profits. 2 years ago, I was at the airport in Chicago to fly to our program in Miami. And I ran into a guy I had done a workshop for at Kellogg. He had brought his top 100 people to the workshop, and it was great. It was great to meet him, and he was an incredibly successful entrepreneur. His name's Michael Krasny. He's one of the Unnatural Leaders I'll mention in chapter 9. Anyway, we were catching up because I hadn't seen him for a while. And he looked at me and he pointed a finger at my chest and he said, by the way, you're the one who's responsible, or he said, you're responsible for the financial crisis. I said, geez, thanks. What do you mean? And he said, no, not you individually. He said, business schools. Business schools are responsible for the financial crisis because when you go to business school, they tell you, maximize profits. He said, that's completely wrong. What you should do is maximize value. Nice, subtle change. He's a pretty smart guy. I'll tell you more about him in a second, but he kind of bounced around as a young guy, took a computer class in the early 80s, found his niche, bought a computer in the early 80s, was using it, loving it, thinking this is what's going to turn him on for the rest of his life. Was short of money, had to sell his computer. Put an ad in the paper, sold it quickly, and got several calls from people who said, oh, you sold your computer? I would have bought it from you. So he said, well, don't worry, I'll get you a computer. Give me your phone number. So what does he do? But he buys a couple other used computers and sells them at a profit to the people who are calling him. Within a couple months, he was selling 100 computers a month out of the trunk of his car. In 2007, he sold his 40% share in CDW. JD, are you here? How much did he pull from it? I'm not sure. Billions. So he's like about the 58th richest person in the US. So from nothing, 25 years, 20 years, right? 22 years, something like that, to the 58th, 57th richest person. But he wasn't a real profit-oriented guy. He was value-oriented. The last chapter of the book is Unnatural Leaders, people who do things differently. And Michael Krasny was a guy who did things differently. And CDW is not the low-cost provider. They provide value, they build relationships, they do all of the things that I like to talk about. Phil Jackson is a leader I've mentioned 100 times. I'll just mention again, you watch a basketball coach during a game and they run up and down the sideline screaming at their team members while they're trying to do their jobs. I don't get it. Phil Jackson sits on the sidelines with his arms crossed and his legs crossed and he lets his players play. Truly unnatural. So Ichiro Honda. I love to tell Honda stories as well. Honda was brilliant, but not the normal Japanese CEO. And Honda was all about trust, and in particular, trusting Takeo Fujisawa, the guy who ran all of his plants. Honda was brilliant with creative ideas. He was also brilliant at subjecting them to criticism. And Takeo Fujisawa was his very calm, organized criticizer in making sure that they didn't pursue bad ideas. Norbert Brynen was the first violinist in the Amadeus String Quartet. 30 years ago, I had a sabbatical to England, and part of my sabbatical, I interviewed all of the string quartets in England for a research project. How do these four people work together so well? I knew nothing about classical music, absolutely nothing. But, you know, when they'd start speaking music, it's kind of like you're in a foreign country and you don't speak the language. So what did I do but smile and nod and acted like I knew what they were talking about? But what I found was, I'd always ask the group members on their own, what's the best thing about being in a string quartet? They said, this close relationship you have with these three other people, it's fantastic. I said, what's the worst thing about being in a string quartet? They say, this close relationship with these three other people. But Brynen was dynamic, exuberant, obsessive, intelligent. I saw them play in concert. Now, you know, I grew up in the 60s. For me, rock and roll was the only music that ever needed to exist. I go to this concert, 4 guys in their 60s playing stringed instruments and classical music. Did I like this concert? Well, do you remember the old Maxell ad where there's a guy sitting in a chair with shades and the music's on and he's being blown out of his chair? That's what happened to me when I heard the Amadeus Quartet. It was astonishing. This guy had vibrancy like nobody's business. You know, Mick Jagger and Bono have nothing on Norbert Brynen. But he also led his team incredibly well because he's the leader of the quartet. And when I interviewed him, you know, he talked about quartet music being a religion, the opportunity to dedicate it yourself, absolutely amazing. He said, I take this quartet and I mold it the way I want it to play, but it's got to be a democracy. And he'd have this twinkle in his eye because on the one hand he knew he had to be a really strong leader, and on the other hand he knew it had to be a democracy. And he pulled it off like nobody's business. These 4 people in the Amadeus Quartet played together, same group, 40 years, no change in the membership of the quartet. And the only reason they stopped is because one of their members died of a heart attack and the other 3 couldn't go on with somebody else. Pretty incredible. Michael Abrashoff is the author of It's Your Ship, one of my 2 favorite leadership books other than this new one coming out are Phil Jackson's and Michael Abrashoff's. And he was the consummate CEO, walking the deck and pinning a medal on anybody who was doing anything heroic. All sorts of insights in his book, and he's one of the epitomes of doing nothing. So an executive student told me a story about him. The executive was in the Navy at the time, and one of the sailors was going to re-enlist and had invited him to chair the re-enlistment ceremony. So the sailor told him, I hope I can introduce you to my captain and you might get 10 minutes with him, the captain being Abrashoff. So this guy shows up at the USS Benfold, the ship that Abrashoff was captain of. He showed up on the dock. He said Abrashoff met him on the dock, escorted him on the boat, stayed with him the whole day, and all day long he walked him around the ship and introduced him to one sailor after another. And each time he introduced him to a sailor, he said, Sailor, tell our visitor what you do. That's all he did all day. And then he escorted him off the ship at the end of the day and said, thanks for coming to see us. What did Michael Abrashoff do that whole day? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. But think what an impact, what a reaction it had on his sailors. Pretty incredible. Maggie Doyne, tough story for me to tell. Maggie Doyne graduated from high school. She was the 3-sport athlete. She was a really good student. She decided not to go to college right away. She decided to travel around the world. She was doing volunteer work in India, met a young girl from Nepal, struck up a friendship. Nepal had been going through civil war. The civil war was just ending. She took 5 days to travel by bus and on foot with this girl to her town in Nepal to see how it had survived the war. During that 5 days, she ran into all sorts of kids breaking rocks so they could sell it as gravel. One of the girls she met, young girl, bright, interesting, didn't have enough money to go to school. So Maggie said, you know, how much does it cost? Well, it cost $8 for supplies and $7 for tuition. She said, hey, 15 bucks, no problem. She paid it. She said, oh, I could pay for more than one maybe. Well, what ends up happening is in Nepal, she raises enough money to build a school. She raises enough money to build an orphanage. There are now 250 kids at the orphanage, 250 at the school, 50 at the orphanage, knocking on doors all the time. She's the principal of the school, but she hasn't gone to college. 24 years old. Amazing. Oprah Winfrey, she's my de-emphasized profits leader. She's pretty successful monetarily. But what does she do? She follows an inner voice. Okay, she cares about people. She wants to do right by them. That's what drives her. Of course, she's wildly energetic, and it's hard for her to do nothing. She taught at Kellogg for 2 years. She taught a leadership course. She would have some nice friends who could come and guest speak. So Jeff Bezos came, and Coretta Scott King came, and Henry Kissinger came, and it was a pretty good course. She taught it for 2 years. Do you know why she quit? She got tired of the grading. She employed our PhD students to do the grading. But she couldn't let it alone. She couldn't just use their comments. She had to read every paper and grade it herself. If she could only have known to do nothing, she might still be teaching at Kellogg. Anyway, each of these folks exemplify one of the chapters, and it makes for a nice end and some great examples. I'm going to stop here. I'm going to turn it over for questions. Linda.
How has your advice, teaching, or approach changed since you wrote your last book?
That's a great question. So part of this book is because of you, all of you. I can't write a book like this unless I've had a chance to talk to hundreds of executives who have wonderful stories and tremendous insights. And I can then bring research ideas to support those insights to, I think, make the point stronger. So part of what I've been fortunate about is having to be surrounded by people like you and our other executive MBA students around the world, and my colleagues at Kellogg, who are wonderful researchers. Absolutely fantastic. So I'm learning stuff all the time. And as I tell my kids, I still go to school every day. It's a blast. I have the best job in the world, and it keeps me going. And, I must tell you that, I know people my age who start getting Alzheimer's, and it scares the heck out of me, because it doesn't seem to have anything to do with how active you are intellectually. It can hit anybody, and that's one of my huge fears, that it'll all of a sudden start hitting me when I've got more to learn. I was thinking a while ago about retiring at some point, but last year I was teaching in our Hong Kong program, and the other faculty member who travels to Hong Kong with me each year is Don Jacobs, our ex-dean. He's still teaching at 84. I watched him, I said, what the heck am I doing thinking about retiring? I'm having too good a time. So I think I just learn more, and I get pressed by people in my classes that pushes me to new ideas and new ways to think about things. So yeah, a lot of it is because of you. Yes.
If you could give one chapter from your book to Obama, which chapter would you give him?
Oh, what a great question. Which chapter would I give him? I might give him the last one with the Unnatural Leaders, because that kind of hits all the points. And he had the opportunity to be an unnatural leader. I think that, when he came into office, it was on a wave of, let's get in touch with our values and live them as a country and live them as a leader. And he's had a hard time doing that. There was a New Yorker article about him a couple months ago that really focused on the dilemmas that he had and the tough choices he had to make. Far too practical and far less oriented toward values. And that's what I miss most. I fear that the reality of his position makes it hard for him to be that values-oriented leader that we all hoped he would be. But I'd love to see him come back to that if he gets reelected. And thanks for putting me on the spot. Yeah. You got a microphone coming.
So a lot of the questions, a lot of the examples you gave in your talk were about the top leaders in different organizations, people that are at the top, and it seems like they probably pay enough people that they can sit around and do nothing. How far down the organization do your concepts go, or is there one particular concept that you think should go right down to everyone that's managing people?
This is another great question. Do nothing doesn't work for entrepreneurs. You know, you start a company, you have to do everything. You know, too bad. It's the way it goes. You know, you're going to hire somebody and do less. You hire somebody else and you do less. And the more people you hire, the less you can do. Okay? So entrepreneurs are kind of out. Likewise, if you face a situation where you're the only person with the skills necessary to complete a task, you need to do them. But you should only do it once. And then you should train somebody else in your team to do it so that you don't have to the next time. So in fact, my examples here are pretty top guys, you're right. I mean, Norbert Brynen was only the leader of a 4-person team. Maggie Doyne, you know, she clearly is a leader, but it's incredible how much control she gives away. So she's got a board of directors for the school that are local townspeople who've never gone to school themselves. It's amazing. She talks about how brilliant they are and how important their ideas are for what a school should be given the area where she's working. Because she grew up in New Jersey and she's living in Nepal. She doesn't have all of the ideas that are necessary there. So to get to your question more directly, I've always had a focus on leaders and their immediate team members. Your direct reports and leaders can be way down in the organization at a foreman level, for instance, and I think these things apply. Too many leaders do too much. One of the things that I realized, you know, back to Linda's question, we always talk about micromanaging, we always talk about trust. In fact, you have only those two choices. You can either trust people or you will micromanage in their eyes. So do the unnatural thing, get away from micromanaging, trust more, and you can do that at lower levels with teams at all levels of the organization. Thank you. Haley.
I have 2 questions that I've asked in class before, and I think I'm getting the answer, but I'd like to ask again.
Sure. I didn't answer it well the last time.
No. Okay. So say you are. There's a comment that you made in class, which is people get to a certain position because they have what it takes to do that job, or you couldn't find someone.
Because they couldn't find anybody else, right?
Couldn't find anyone else. So I've seen this play out. If you are a CEO of an organization or a senior person, and you're in that situation, how do you relinquish control and just trust that that person would do their job if they weren't your first choice for that position when you made that choice?
The thing that we all, I think, come back to is an old saying, if you want something done well, you've got to do it yourself. And many of us believe that because we're egocentric and we value what we do. I got to tell you, when I first started learning how to cook, I ate a lot of lousy meals. But I ate them anyway because I had cooked them. Not smart. You got to take the risk. It's a risk. Every time you trust, you take a risk. And the other thing that I think is something that we're uncomfortable with is that when we let somebody do a job that we're not sure they can do, and they do it in a way that we wouldn't do it, we're more critical than we might otherwise be because they might have even succeeded. They just did it a way that we didn't. So the other thing that I mentioned in the book something I learned in high school. So, you know, we actually do remember things from high school. Isaac Newton was one. But the other is a concept called comparative advantage. And comparative advantage is all about assigning jobs to people in terms of making sure you get all of the elements that are critical done. But if you're the best person to bake bread in your organization, you shouldn't necessarily bake bread if somebody else can bake it well also, and you can do something else that fewer people can do. Right? So in fact, what you don't want is a desire for perfect to get in the way of good enough. And we too often have this desire for perfect and that we've got to do it, when good enough will actually serve you pretty well, spread the burden, and allow other people to grow and flourish more, and you're better off in the long run. So another element that limits it is our horrendously short-term focus and my desire to do away with quarterly reports if only I could. Yeah, but I'm not going to go on that button too hard. Hey.
So do you talk somewhere in your book about a leader actually sort of being the glue at
Being the glue?
the apex of the team?
Sure.
Because it doesn't seem to jump out at
Yeah, it doesn't. And one of the things, so the question up front was, what about leaders as the glue? One of the things that I talk about a lot in terms of, let me just see if I have just a do nothing at the end. No, I don't. Leaders should facilitate and orchestrate. And if you are facilitating, you are the glue, okay? You're the person people come to. See, one of the parts of the book I say leaders should just be just like the internet. Your leader should be the person you go to when you've got a question and you don't have the answer. Okay? That's what we do with the internet, right? And in that sense, you want to facilitate, provide assistance, provide information, provide resources, and be there. So Michael Abershoff, as my do-nothing CEO, he walked the deck of his ship every day. The CEO for Starbucks, I forget his name. Thank you. And they've had ups and downs. But, you know, I remember reading an article when he travels to one location or another, he tries to set up only half of his day with meetings. The other half of the day, he wants to go to various Starbucks stores and talk to people who work there and actually take over a job and talk to customers as well. Get right back down to the bottom line. So you do want to be there. You want to be a real presence. Herb Kelleher at Southwest Airlines. Everybody knew him. He knew everybody. He was, you know, a central figure that everybody admired and could relate to and acted like that glue. So when you do nothing, it doesn't mean you go play golf. You're still at the office, you're thinking, you're strategizing, you're facilitating, you're orchestrating. And in that sense, you are magnetic. Yeah. Sure.
Steve Jobs, he did a lot of work. But from what I understand, what you're saying then is, it's not that he pushed people aside and did the work. It was that the work that was either based on feedback or facilitation.
So Steve Jobs did not design your iPhone.
But he did.
He didn't. He wasn't the designer. He might have sketched out a picture or something like that, but I know who the designers were. Right? He had the concept. Right?
I mean, in the long, drawn-out book came out, there's lots of discussion about John and Ivy and him.
Right.
And in a lot of situations, it seems that with his father being a machinist, he was actually very involved, even down to the last minute, changing things.
Sure.
And yeah, it does seem like at times he was a micromanager.
Oh, he was. There is absolutely no question he was a micromanager, way too much. to my mind. You know, just could he have been more successful? I mean, he was wildly successful, but he was a wildly failing many times too, right? So, you know, he got better with age, at least as a decision maker. And you know, the single examples are both easy as a plus and easy as a minus. I think the philosophy has to be driven by lots of information. And I can tell you, I get lots of feedback from old students about doing nothing. And the rare ones, you know, when I'm in class, and I said, so anybody in this class do nothing? Occasionally maybe one person out of 50 will raise their hand. I don't do anything. And they have a huge smile on their face. And everybody's looking at them like, wow, how do you get away with it? And they'll tell the story, you know, I have a great team. They do this, they do that. All I have to do is be there in case they need me. I don't do anything. And they say, it's great. And, you know, we're making plans for something new on the horizon. So they're always planning, right? And son of a gun, if you're not fighting fires about everyday work, you can actually plan. Steve Jobs did some planning. Yeah.
You know, you hear about folks that say you should lead by example.
Yeah.
And then you get some people looking at their leader and they're seeing this leader not doing anything. The desk's always clean and they're always inundated with paperwork. And so how does that work? Because the perception from their direct reports is going to have a sort of negative perception of their leader.
Absolutely. And I've gotten this question before. So lead by example, right? And be an example for people. What you want to do is be an example in terms of values, commitment, ideology, love of the work, passion for what's going on, okay? None of those require work. And there's a lot of people who are worried that if they do nothing, people are going to say, she doesn't do anything. Why should she get the credit? Well, she's going to get the credit if her teams are consistently successful. A couple years ago, there was I don't remember who the basketball player was, but he, you know, complained about Phil Jackson doing nothing. And Phil Jackson just laughed, you know, you know, he said, I'm happy for people to think I do nothing. Just look at my record. That's all you have to do. So, I mean, if you're doing nothing and your teams are unsuccessful, you're not in a good spot, you know? But what you see happening, so part of the push for this book is that 97.6%, I don't have a good number, but a huge number of leaders do too much. They could do less. And if you push them to do less and they try it and it works, they do less and they do less and they do less, and ultimately they can do nothing. And that's the reason for taking the strong stand, okay? And you know, some of my early readers, I'm pleased that they get it. They are smart people, I like them a lot, but they have great insight and they've been successful and, you know, they get it. Linda?
Is it fair to say that you have to do something before you can do nothing?
Absolutely, you must do something before you do nothing. No question. Most of us don't start out at the top of the heap, right? And most of us don't start out in leading teams. We're team members first. But, you know, here's the other thing. Imagine, how many of you are engineers? I thought I might have a few. So your first job, you're designing, you're drafting, you're doing engineering stuff. As you move up, you do less and less and less engineering. I don't think there's any Fortune 500 CEO out there who does his or her own taxes, mows her own lawn, right? It doesn't happen. You move up, you're supposed to have a bigger picture and do less work. But too many of us anchor on our old jobs where we were doing something and we hang on to that because we were successful at it and we don't let it go quickly enough. Yeah, Karen.
On that topic, I have an engineer who would be a great manager, and I keep giving him tasks, and he comes to me and says, I'm worried of losing my technical.
Yeah.
How do I convince him that losing your technical is okay? And he's doing his MBA, so it's not like he
So you know, we are all children at heart. His security blanket are his technical skills, right? And so as he could move up and he holds on to his security blanket, he's going to remain immature. What do you do with your kid's security blanket to make sure they let go of it before they go to college? You lose it on a trip or something along those lines. So somehow or another you have to have him lose his skills, be out of his depth, only managerial. No longer can he lean on those skills, and if he can succeed when you've thrown him over the boat into that deep water, he'll be just fine. But you know, your facilitation in this case might need to be a swift kick.
One more question, then we'll get an exit.
You mean then we can have a drink? Yes. Oh, right. Sure.
Is do nothing can it exist in an organization by itself, or is it a cultural?
So yeah, this is a great question. Can do nothing exist in an organization by itself, or is it cultural? You leading your team, if you could do it in a vacuum, you could work to being doing nothing, right? But if you do nothing and your team is successful, what you have done is trained and raised people who can take over leadership positions themselves and spread that kind of idea. So it can spread, okay? It doesn't have to be get the stamp of approval right away. I mean, there are a lot of things that leaders do with their own teams that are devious that their superiors never know they're doing because they're effective and they don't want constraints. Okay? All of us know about that. Second thing, when I was talking about those fixed versus growth mindsets, if you have leaders, particularly CEOs, who have fixed mindsets, who says that people can't grow, and I'm going to put you in the slot where you belong, and I know what your succession plan is, and I know where it's going to end, and that's the way it is because that's who you are, that's hard to overcome. Very hard to overcome. Because a CEO who has that kind of idea, you know, the CEO puts a stamp on the entire organization. A CEO with a growth mindset, oh man, then there's an opportunity for diversification. There's an opportunity for new challenges. You know, there's just so many opportunities there that you don't get with a fixed mindset. So I think that in that sense, there may be some cultural element to it. And a really closed-minded CEO is going to have a really closed-minded organization. It's going to be damn depressing, and it's not going to be much fun, and you should find a different organization or start your own and start doing nothing. And have a drink. Thanks very much.